All right, let us gavel in and begin. As this hearing is fully virtual, we have to address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I may ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there is a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of the speaking order, we will begin with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And then finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. The subcommittee shall come to order. Good morning and welcome to today's hearing on the Economic Development Administration's, or EDA's, role in the response to the pandemic. With us today, we have the acting head of EDA, the acting Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Economic Development, Mr. Dennis Alvord. Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Alvord. And as the only federal agency dedicated exclusively to economic development, EDA has a critical role in responding to the economic crisis that has been brought on by this COVID-19 pandemic. In 2020, GDP fell by 3.5% nationwide and 4.4% in my home Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And while we're already seeing the signs of a strong recovery, this pandemic has clearly demonstrated the inequity in our economic system. The unemployment rate for those with a college degree is only 3.7%, whereas it is 8.2% for those without a high school diploma. The overall unemployment number is back down to 6.0%, which does not sound so terrible, except when you note that nearly 4.7 million Americans have taken themselves out of the workforce since last year. In so many ways, it's not just these immediate impacts of the pandemic that I'm concerned about. If anything, the virus has merely highlighted just how increasingly unfair our system had become prior to the last year. Our economy is evolving rapidly, and when that means new smartphones and Netflix, it's great, but I worry about what it means for everyday Americans. I think about towns like Carbondale in my district in Pennsylvania. During the boom of the anthracite coal industry, Carbondale had been a company town that had boomed right along with it. But when the coal industry packed up and walked away from the city of Carbondale, they left an environmentally scarred landscape and an economy that has never come close to recovering. If a fire started in town, entire blocks would burn down for lack of capacity to respond. The housing the coal and rail companies had built for their workers were not built to last and needed serious investments and upgrades almost immediately. And more than that, underground mine fires burned in multiple locations throughout the city. Those fires have smoldered even into the 21st century with the Bureau of Abandoned Mines putting 2 more out within the past 5 years. The road back for the city of Carbondale has been a long, difficult, tedious, and uphill battle with fits and starts of success as local leaders have struggled to revitalize the core business district and build permanent assets to shore up the community and the local economy as well. So when I think about what EDA can do for people, I think about Carbondale and the struggle that they've endured and what it still needs. And I worry about all these other communities that are also struggling, whether it's due to the pandemic or other changing economic circumstances in their towns, often completely beyond their control. We can do more to make sure that communities all across America not only recover from the pandemic, but have real economic vitality. It is a smart investment in our people and our country that will pay huge dividends over time. I was proud to help write the American Rescue Plan Act that provided an additional $3 billion for EDA to help communities respond to the economic fallout of the pandemic. I am excited to hear from our witness today about our progress in overcoming the immediate hardships brought on by COVID, and also about how we're investing in long-term strategies to support good jobs for all Americans. Mr. Alvord, given your background and expertise, it is a privilege to have you with us here today to have this important discussion. But before we begin, I would like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Aderholt, at this time for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be with you this morning, and good to have our guest today, Mr. Alvord. Thank you for being with us to share your insight on economic development and how that's role in the pandemic response. I'm pleased to be here virtually with everyone today to as we look at the oversight for EDA's role in the federal government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In recent years, this agency has played an increasingly large role in the federal response to disasters and economic distress. And in the span of just over 1 year, Congress has tasked it with administering an extraordinary amount of federal dollars, a total of $4.5 billion of the federal government's response to the coronavirus pandemic, to be exact. Our nation's small businesses and manufacturers are the engines that drive the American economy, and ensuring they have the resources to succeed as we continue to navigate this pandemic, and this is vital. President Trump made restoring economic prosperity across the United States a top priority. And prior to this pandemic, we saw manufacturing jobs return and employment increase to levels that we had not seen in this country in many years. That's why I'm pleased to see that almost immediately upon enactment of the CARES Act last year, the Commerce Department began working diligently to help our nation's economy rebound from the impacts of COVID-19. Numerous investments have helped small businesses across the country, and in my state of Alabama, gain access to necessary capital to sustain them during this pandemic, and in turn create a stronger and more resilient state economy for our future. And I think it's appropriate to credit the former administration and the staff of the Economic Development Administration, who truly rose to the occasion for working so diligently to ensure that the CARES Act was, and it continues to be, allocated to the communities that are in most need. These efforts did not go unappreciated in Washington either. The Commerce Department's Office of Inspector General credited EDA with being proactive in its implementation of the CARES Act and leveraging technology, as well as hiring flexibility to mitigate the challenges of administering such a large, time-sensitive effort during the very pandemic it was to counter. EDA even exceeded its own obligation milestones in the course of awarding its funding. Back home, our constituents are rightly concerned about the future of our communities and the effect of this pandemic it's having on the workforce. Today, we can try to find answers to some of their remaining questions and hear about how the Commerce Department intends to distribute the funds provided that it received during the relief package. It remains critical that EDA administer this funding in a manner that reduces risk of waste, fraud, abuse, and of course, mismanagement. Also want to discuss the importance of broadband technology for economic development and hear about what more EDA can do to help expand broadband connectivity. Regrettably, this pandemic has fully exposed the adverse consequences of a lack of connectivity, particularly for our school children and people who could benefit from telehealth at a time when our healthcare facilities are so very much strained. We're counting on EDA to use these resources to help our communities rebound from this pandemic and emerge even stronger. Mr. Alford, I am looking forward to hearing about these resources, how they'll be leveraged to expand broadband and infrastructure, spur increases in much needed manufacturing as well. Again, we thank you for being here today appearing before the subcommittee, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. And Mr. Alvord, you are recognized at this time for your opening remarks, which we would ask you to keep to 5 minutes. And remember that your entire opening statement will be submitted for the record. You're recognized, Mr. Alvord.
Thank you, Chairman Cartwright, Ranking Member Adderholt, and members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to appear before you today to testify on behalf of the Department of Commerce's Economic Development Administration. EDA welcomes this hearing as an opportunity to discuss our role in COVID-19 recovery efforts through EDA's implementation of the CARES Act. EDA's efforts provide relief to and promote long-term recovery efforts in communities hard hit by the pandemic. Over the last 4 years, EDA's budget authority has grown substantially. In 2018 and 2019, through 2 disaster supplementals, EDA's budget authority grew to $901.5 million and $904 million respectively. In 2020, Congress provided the agency a historic influx of $1.5 billion under the CARES Act. Less than 1 year later, EDA has received an additional $3 billion in funding under the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. With each supplemental, EDA is further entrusted to take on a greater and more prominent role in supporting communities recovering from the sudden economic disruption and dislocation. EDA investments generate or retain jobs, attract new industry and private sector investment, encourage business expansion, and serve as a backstop to sudden and severe economic dislocations to local economies. We're aware of our important role in ensuring the funds are invested in an equitable, fair, and impactful manner, and that we are reaching the communities most in need of our assistance. Because of the unusual and compelling urgency of the economic dislocations caused by the coronavirus pandemic, EDA determined that the public interest would be best served by using a portion of its supplemental CARES Act funding to expeditiously make awards to existing high-performing EDA grant recipients with unique capacities to respond rapidly to the situation. EDA made awards to its network of economic development districts, university centers, and tribal planning organizations. The awards fund the cost of economic recovery coordination and technical assistance activities to support recovery from the pandemic within the geographic areas served by these organizations. These investments also helped to develop a pipeline of infrastructure and workforce projects that EDA funded using the remaining CARES Act funds and will use to source projects for the upcoming American Rescue Plan Act competitions. In light of the immediate capital needs of small businesses unable to secure traditional financing, EDA also expeditiously infused additional capital into its revolving loan fund program using CARES Act funds. After meeting immediate needs, EDA funded a diverse range of economic recovery implementation projects using its flexible economic adjustment assistance program. EDA also launched the new Scaling Pandemic Resilience Through Innovation and Technology Challenge. The Sprint Challenge is a $29 million national competition under which EDA sought projects that will enable organizations across the country to address the economic health and safety risks caused by the coronavirus pandemic through entrepreneurship and innovation. Our CARES Act investments are supporting a variety of critical economic development strategies that are helping communities to recover and set a course for future prosperity. And today, I'm pleased to note that EDA has awarded more than $1 billion in CARES Act grants and met this significant milestone in less than 1 year from the enactment of the CARES Act. EDA's work continues, and as of April 16, 2021, EDA has obligated $1.098 billion of the $1.5 billion in supplemental CARES Act funding through 1,020 awards to communities across the country. I'm proud of the fortitude shown by our grantee partners in responding to this crisis, and I'm inspired by the dedication of EDA's incredible staff as shown in meeting the challenge of quickly and responsibly awarding this important funding. The American Rescue Plan provides additional relief to address the continued impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. The Act allocates supplemental funding of $3 billion to EDA to assist communities nationwide in advancing their coronavirus recovery and resiliency strategies. Though EDA is still finalizing its implementation plan for this funding, the execution will focus on bringing back American workforce in industries that have been hardest hit, such as travel and tourism and manufacturing, capitalizing on American ingenuity to build regions of the future by focusing on innovation-led economic development, and pursuing a comprehensive approach to advancing equity by focusing on populations and underserved communities that have been denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic prosperity. EDA looks forward to further briefing the subcommittee as its implementation plans solidify. Chairman Cartwright, Ranking Member Adderholt, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to address EDA's efforts to assist communities in responding to the economic injury caused by the coronavirus pandemic. I'm proud of the agency's critical role in supporting communities recovering from the economic devastation wrought by the pandemic, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Alvord. And as I said in my opening statement, I certainly support EDA and its mission. And I appreciate you mentioning EDA's work with the Northeastern Pennsylvania Alliance in your testimony. I hope today we can investigate how we can build on that work and expand efforts in areas like my district. First, I think I'll start with a question that'll help set the stage for this hearing. Can you please just tell us briefly, what are the types of projects that you've been able to fund with the CARES Act fund? And do you expect the American Rescue Plan Act to be the same? Are there any easy characterizations of the projects? And do you know a rough breakdown of how the money was spent by category of project?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for the question. And EDA was able to fund a diverse range of different types of projects using the CARES Act funding, using our flexible economic adjustment assistance program. Much of our early work, as I mentioned, focused on grants to our existing network of high-performing economic development partners. So those included grants for strategies and technical assistance to help areas and regions to develop recovery strategies and coordinate assistance to aid in recovery. They included grants to our tribal planning grantees to help those organizations engage in similar activities. We harnessed our University Center program to leverage their inherent expertise in helping to assist communities and regions and provide technical assistance to businesses and entrepreneurs within their regions. And we supplemented very heavily our network of revolving loan fund providers to address very directly the capital access needs. In addition to that, we developed, I think, a robust pipeline of projects, implementation style projects to support strategies, marketing recovery strategies, also a wide range of different types of infrastructure investment projects to help regions to recover and bounce back.
Well, thank you for that. With the American Rescue Plan, it is my hope that rather than focusing on regional economic planning, you will actually be doing more implementation work. Is that your expectation for the American Rescue Plan?
Yes, Chairman, it is. We were very deliberate in our approach to the CARES Act, kind of understanding where communities were at the onset and wanting to use our initial grants to build capacity, to support, long-term planning and strategies for recovery. With the expectation that those strategies and the recovery coordinators that we put in place could assist with the competitive awards through the CARES Act, but also any additional supplemental funding that EDA might receive, as well as our core economic development assistance programming. I feel like we've done a very good job in establishing that capacity, and that we'll put a lot of additional emphasis on implementation. That said, there are still some areas that I think may benefit from some additional planning, strategy, and capacity building, and we stand ready to support those needs as well.
And how will the breakdown of categories of projects funded through the CARES Act change with funds from the American Rescue Plan?
Well, as I mentioned, we did leverage very heavily our existing network of economic development partners in implementing the CARES Act. And I think, based on what we've learned as a result of that investment, we intend to design strategies that will be very impactful in helping communities to both bounce back quickly from the economic impacts from the pandemic, so more in the way of specific implementation strategies, and position those communities for long-term economic growth and success. So we will likely take a more targeted approach under the American Rescue Plan in trying to reach underserved areas, and trying to focus on particular areas of emphasis, such as industries, sectors that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, like travel and tourism, manufacturing, and others. And hopefully that will enable us to really build upon the foundations that we laid with the CARES Act funding.
Okay, last question. How much of CARES Act funding went to new eligible organizations and first-time recipients versus current and past recipients? And my hope is that as you expand into more implementation work rather than planning work, you will look to find more new partners.
Yes. I can say that of the CARES Act awards that we made, approximately a little more than $800 million, or 53% or so of the competitive funding that we had available for awards, after taking funding out to support salaries and expenses, administrative costs and operations, as well as the Inspector General oversight of the program, went to existing grantee organizations. So about 53%. And the balance of those fundings went into other competitive implementation awards. We do expect that a vast majority of the American Rescue Plan funding will be going into implementation activities.
Well, thank you, Mr. Alvord. My time has expired, and I recognize our ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, for 5 minutes of questions. You're on mute, Mr. Adderholt.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Good. Yep.
All right. Wanted to talk a little bit more. In my opening statement, I mentioned broadband, but want to focus on it a little bit more. Of course, unfortunately, the lack of sufficient broadband in rural communities was an issue well before COVID-19 came into play. And as I, again, referred to in my opening statement, the COVID-19 pandemic really fully exposed the adverse consequences for a lack of broadband access, especially in rural America. Can you, Mr. Alford, discuss the how EDA's funding Congress provided in the CARES Act has been used to assist in the development of broadband infrastructure. You know, I know this is a deep subject, but from a 30,000-foot level, could you talk about that just a little bit?
Absolutely, and thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. I think there's three primary ways that EDA has been assisting with broadband development under the CARES Act. I mentioned that we had provided assistance to our multi-county economic development districts to engage in economic recovery planning activities. And certainly planning for broadband needs would be an eligible activity under the scope of work for those grant awards. And I think many of our economic development districts took advantage of that opportunity to do just that. And we're certainly very cognizant that the pandemic really did shine a spotlight on the needs for enhanced broadband connectivity, really both in rural and underserved urban areas as well. Second, we provided some strategic grants to communities to allow them to undertake technical and market feasibility studies so that they could determine what the best broadband solutions were for their region and their communities. And finally, we funded infrastructure to actually bring broadband to unserved areas in some cases as well.
Okay, thank you. Of course, we recognize the role that EDA plays in saving jobs, of course, opening new opportunities for economic growth and helping spur creation of jobs in rural communities. One example that I can point to is back in 2018, one of my community colleges that is located within my district, Wallace State Community College, located in Hanceville, Alabama, was awarded $2 million to help build a new welding training center and business incubator. Investments like these, such as at Wallace State, not only benefit our local community and regional development, but also serve national interests, such as driving long-term economic growth. My question, to what extent has the pandemic impacted the amount of local and private investment that EDA has been able to leverage? And what are some ways that EDA has worked to address this particular issue?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. And the types of investments that you highlight, I think, are in terms of workforce development projects and business incubation projects are really critically important building blocks to success. And those are some of the types of grant investments we hope to make under the American Rescue Plan as well, and have made under the CARES Act. So we have definitely seen cases under our CARES Act grant making where communities are having a more challenging time coming up with local matching funds to support EDA investments, and we have tried to be accommodating, given the flexibilities that Congress granted us under the Act, to provide up to 100% grant rates. We do that based on the individual circumstances of each grantee, and whether or not they have the ability to make a contribution or not, or if they may have exhausted effectively their taxing and borrowing authority due to the impacts of the pandemic. In terms of private investment, we are still continuing to look for opportunities to leverage additional private investment as part of our grant making, because we find that produces much more impactful results, and is really critical to the success of our investments. So, fortunately, we have been successful in continuing to do so through our CARES Act grant making.
All right, I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Adderholt. At this time, the chair recognizes Ms. Meng from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Acting Assistant Secretary Alvord, for joining us today. We owe you a debt of gratitude for the concurrent duties that you are performing, especially during COVID. I wanted to ask about the EDA's approach to economic injury in light of COVID. Historically, EDA funds have favored rural areas, typically by a ratio of 2 to 3 for rural areas versus 1 to 3 for urban areas. I don't think anyone questioned this model before the pandemic. However, during the quarantine, which exposed the soft underbelly of major urban centers' reliance on tourism, for example, from restaurants to theaters to sporting events, no one was left unscathed. My district in Queens, New York, suffered near total economic collapse last spring as everyone went into lockdown mode. Many businesses experienced unprecedented decline in businesses, and many are still recovering. So, wanted to ask from your perspective, is EDA's current model sufficient to help urban areas revitalize? Does Congress need to reassess it in light of the pandemic's effect on urban areas?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the kind words, and thank you for the question. I think one of the strengths of EDA's program is its inherent flexibility and our ability to be agile and respond to different types of changing economic distress. And we have unquestionably seen the phenomena that you mentioned where high population centers have been really disproportionately, in some cases, impacted by the health and economic impacts of the pandemic. And we do have flexibility under our program to address those areas. We are able to look at different sizes of geography when we are making grant awards. So we're cognizant of the fact that even in places of relative affluence, there are many times pockets of poverty or economic distress that need to be addressed. And I believe that we do have adequate flexibility under our authorization to make grant awards in those cases and address those pockets.
Thank you. Last year's spending bill included language requiring EDA to direct 10% of its funds towards helping persistent poverty counties, specifically in rural areas. The accompanying report also included concern that high poverty urban areas were often overlooked because their needs were overshadowed by affluent neighbors. For example, while New York City is affluent, there are pockets across our 5 counties that make up the city as a whole that have high poverty conditions, including parts of my district in Queens. And I was wondering if and how EDA is evaluating applications from high poverty urban areas to ensure their applications receive additional priority.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. And yes, we are very cognizant of that phenomena. In fact, I've spoken with representatives of our Philadelphia regional office, which services New York, and they've informed me that actually some of the most economically distressed areas in the state are in the sub units in the New York cities and surrounding environments, and so they are very aware of this as part of their consideration of grant proposals and investments that come in. And they are able to evaluate those proposals on a competitive basis using the criteria that we've established under our notices of funding opportunity.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Meng. Mr. Palazzo, looks like you got your game face on. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Alvord, thank you for being here today. First and foremost, I want to thank your agency for their work. The global pandemic has caused losses due to health, but also due to suffering economies. From global to local, businesses large and small were struggling to stay afloat and adapt to new laws, restrictions, and modes of business. Likewise, to some of my colleagues' districts, the Mississippi Gulf Coast relies heavily on tourism to bolster the local and state economy. The EDA's most recent award to the Mississippi Gulf Coast Regional Convention and Visitors Bureau in Biloxi, Mississippi, to develop and implement a tourism recovery marketing campaign in response to the COVID-created economic downturn will be a great help to spreading the word of what the Gulf Coast has to offer. From our beautiful white beaches, a brand new world-class aquarium, the best seafood in the world, to activities like fishing and gambling, you can find something for everyone on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. So this all leads me to the following. Between the CARES bill and the administration's American Rescue Plan, there was some misunderstanding amongst members regarding the distribution of funds. While I agree with the distribution process, can you please explain why your agency distributes funds based on a level of economic distress versus per capita?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for the question, and I do anticipate that given the set aside funding that was provided as part of the $3 billion under the American Rescue Plan, EDA will be doing even a lot more work in the travel and tourism sector under the American Rescue Plan. In terms of the distribution or allocation that we use for EDA funding, typically we look at a variety of different factors and we make those determinations on a case-by-case basis. So for example, we have an allocation that we use for EDA's regular economic development assistance programs. When we receive supplemental funding for natural disasters, we might develop a different allocation that addresses the exigencies of that particular disaster or economic situation. And that was similarly true for the CARES Act, where we looked at a variety of different factors that were indicia of the distress under the CARES Act, and we developed an allocation that was specific to that, and that included factors including population and different economic distress criteria. Core to our authorizing statute is our desire to address economic distress.
Okay, I thank you for that response. Between the CARES Act as well as the American Rescue Plan, billions of federal dollars have been allocated to your agency and other agencies. With a surge in funds comes a surge in responsibility for government entities, many of whom did not have this level of responsibility beforehand. The EDA's budget has risen from $267 million in 2017 to $3 billion in 2021. So along with increased COVID-19 funds, various pandemic relief efforts, such as the SBA's Paycheck Protection Program, have increasingly become a target for fraud. Are the EDA's revolving loan fund loans targets of fraud like those that we saw with the PPP program?
Well, thank you again, Congressman, for the question. And I think we're always cognizant and aware of the potential for there to be waste, fraud, and abuse. And we have tried to take a very proactive approach in working with the Commerce's Office of Inspector General in guarding against that. And in fact, one of the very first things that we did upon receiving the CARES Act funding was to engage in a dialogue with the IG. And we had their teams come in and conduct training, sensitivity training for all EDA staff so that they could be better aware and help to spot waste, fraud, and abuse and guard against that. That said, as you mentioned, anytime there is a lot of funding available, there's a lot of people looking to take advantage of that. And so we have to be continually watchful and mindful about the potential for that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Alvord. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. And Congressman Ben Klein, you are recognized for 5 minutes of questions. In the absence of Representative Klein, we will bounce over to Representative Garcia, who is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Alvord, for your time and the information. My question is around defense contractors, folks who are providing critical assets to national security programs around the country. We have a large footprint in our district, in California's 25th district, which is northern LA County. they were afforded, these defense contractors were afforded certain accommodations and were able to continue to work in certain states under the auspices of being essential businesses. Some struggled from state to state, depending on the definition of essential business. But can you tell me, kind of from an EDA perspective, what can be done to help some of these critical national defense component manufacturers throughout this last year, but also moving forward now that supply chains have been disrupted, natural resources have been disrupted. A lot of these products rely on raw earth materials that are now not necessarily guaranteed to show up on time or on cost. We've had struggles with local government county entities, for instance, giving access to the vaccines for these companies, like some of the military would also be. Their military counterparts on the same facility were getting the vaccines, while the civilian private companies were not. And they were sort of hand-in-glove partners on multiple programs, and it slowed down our national defense programs in that regard. Can you speak to that in terms of what the EDA can do to help us not only help improve the current situation, but I think heal and recover from opportunity lost over the last year?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I think this is an area that we're acutely aware of. Unquestionably, among the most impacted industry sectors during the pandemic has been manufacturing and its supply chain, and it has perhaps brought one of the most consequential impacts to our long-term economic recovery. So in designing both our implementation of the CARES Act and certainly as we move forward with the design for the implementation of the American Rescue Plan, we intend to put significant focus on this area. I think there are a variety of tools that EDA can bring to the table, both in terms of developing plans and strategies specifically for the economic recovery and growth of various industry sectors, but then also looking creatively at various industry clusters around the country that have the potential to support expansion and growth and development, and how we can seed those clusters with additional funding and help them to accelerate and grow more rapidly, and in a manner that is more inclusive of populations that have been adversely impacted by the pandemic. So it would be our hope that through some combination of strategy assistance and then implementation grants, that we can support the rebound of those clusters. One other important area that was mentioned earlier is that many times these industries are highly reliant on having a trained and skilled workforce. So it would be our hope that we would be able to support training activities that align very specifically with those industry needs, so that they are able to get the workforce that they need to bounce back more quickly. Thank you, Rami.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you, Mr. Albert, for that. I have less than a minute here, so I'll yield back and save my follow-on questions for the next round, Mr. Chairman.
The member yields back. And this takes us to our next round of questions, and I'll start that off. Mr. Albert, I was happy to see the president's skinny budget included a 150% increase in the Assistance to Coal Communities program that I helped to get started. You can expect me to continue to hold your feet to the fire on this program, to be sure that historical coal communities like mine are not ignored. And it's not just my area, it's the Appalachians that go from northeastern Pennsylvania all the way down into eastern Kentucky and further. Question is the Assistance to Coal Communities program able to meet national demand for funding? How is that assessed, several years into the program, has demand subsided?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, the Assistance to Coal Communities program has been a critically important tool in helping us to support communities that have been reliant on the production of coal or power generation related to coal across the entire country, but specifically and acutely so, as you mentioned, across the Appalachian region. And I will say that we have continued to see robust demand for those program resources, despite budget increases year over year to the program. And while I don't know the exact numbers, I can certainly say anecdotally that we have continued to be oversubscribed in demand for the program.
Has that surprised you?
It has not, because of the nature of these economic adjustment transitions. Quite often what we will see is that they will come in waves, where we may see first an idling of some mining capacity, and then several months or even a year or so later, subsequent idling in power production capacity. And so in both cases, we would want to come back around and assist with the economic adjustment in those areas. And likewise, the impacts have moved, geographically over time as well. What was at first very acutely focused in the eastern United States has also, shifted and also had impacts in the West as well.
All right. The Coal Communities Program provides economic diversification funding for energy industry impacted communities, of course. And so the question is, to what extent can similar programs be developed to support communities dependent on other fossil fuel-based energy industries, such as oil and natural gas, that could face similar challenges to coal in the future as we transition toward renewable energy overall? How could they be developed?
Yes, well, I think we have a really valuable tool, which is the EDA Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. And in fact, the assistance to coal communities is a subcategory of economic adjustment assistance. And it packages together a very flexible set of tools, the ability to do strategy and technical assistance, capitalize revolving loan funds, as well as infrastructure improvements to help areas that have been impacted, had some event that has undermined the nature of their economy. So really, we've learned some valuable lessons as a result of our work assisting coal communities with this economic transition that could certainly be applied to other industry sectors as well. And in fact, EDA has begun a stream of work in helping communities that have nuclear power facilities that have come to the end of their useful life, and helping those communities to undertake some type of economic adjustment and economic diversification opportunities.
Well, of course, it's not just the communities that only recently have been impacted by the declining coal industry that need support. We talked about the city of Carbondale before, but the city of Scranton also dug coal for a century and helped power the country through the Industrial Revolution. They've now had decades of disinvestment, economic dislocation, not to mention the tangible environmental impacts of poisonous water leaching from the abandoned mines into our creeks and rivers. So I'd like to talk about how these funds are being targeted. How are you helping communities that have a long history of coal and are still reeling from the impacts of industry like communities in my district in northeastern Pennsylvania?
Yes. Thank you, Chairman. I come from one of those communities, so I am particularly cognizant and empathetic to those struggles. And I think these are really vexing and challenging problems. But again, EDA has a very flexible set of economic development assistance tools, and we often think about these in two different categories. So there are events that undermine the base of an economy, and we see those as like sudden and severe economic dislocations. And we quite often respond to those through our economic adjustment assistance programs. And then there are communities such as those that you're describing that have suffered under the weight of long-term economic deterioration. Maybe they were once thriving and then an event undermined their economy and they never bounced back. Or in some cases, we still have communities in this country that have really never had a strong economic foundation for growth and prosperity. And so through our core economic development assistance programs, we're really looking to assist those communities over the long term. So we use programs like our partnership planning program to build capacity for recovery. We use our local technical assistance program to develop feasibility studies and strategic opportunities to redevelop brownfield sites, to put idle land back into productive use through new economic development endeavors. And we use our public works program to bring infrastructure and core capacity to those areas where it's missing. So I do think that we have the tools to do that, and we'll be able to really build upon those foundations with the additional resources that have been provided under the American Rescue Plan.
Good to hear, Mr. Albert. Thank you for those answers. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, for another 5 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, let me go ahead and yield to Mr. Klein. I think he's back on now, so I'll go ahead and yield my time at this point to Mr. Klein.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Adderholt. Appreciate the witness for being here. And I was pulled away. We were having a meeting, Zoom meeting with staff with the Restaurant Association, talking about the inability of restaurants to find labor in this challenging environment, and the need to really work to encourage work. And so I hope, I don't really have a question there. I just hope that as Mr. Alford, as you implement these plans, you keep in mind that employers across the country are having challenges finding workers. And I guess I could loop that into a question. I noted in your testimony that you mentioned that you were expanding the loan program, the revolving loan fund, using CARES Act funds. Can you tell me how much you put into there from the CARES Act, and do you plan to duplicate that through this second bill that was enacted here recently?
Yes, we did. Thank you, Congressman, for the question. We did significantly increase the capital that was available through EDA's network of revolving loan fund providers under the CARES Act. And in fact, we supplemented that network to the tune of about $600 million, really in recognition of the dearth of available capital to support businesses during this really, really trying time. And we have been very successful in putting that funding to immediate use and helping businesses with loans for working capital when necessary, or many businesses have taken advantage of the sometimes pause in activity to kind of re-envision their business models and look for expansion opportunities that will allow them to bounce back quickly, when the customers start returning. So we're doing a lot of lending through that assistance, and I'm also acutely aware of the point that you made about businesses need to be able to attract workforce that meets their needs. And we have been supporting a wide range of different types of workforce development investments under our CARES Act implementation, and certainly anticipate doing more of that work under the American Rescue Plan. That is something we've heard a lot from industry about.
And I appreciate that. Capital needs of small businesses, that's part of it. And I'm just thinking of these restaurants I was just talking to who don't have as much. Well, they're having to shut off their online orders. They're having to close early. They're having to. I mean, it's not necessarily a solution that you all are going to be able to provide, but I appreciate you trying to increase that loan fund. It'll help free up capital that otherwise would have had to go to capital needs to reallocate for competing for these limited supply of workers. One of the problems that we have is that governors around the country are not opening up fast enough, and with changing environments, increased vaccination rates, we have, again, government at the state and local level responding late to the realities on the ground. And so in Virginia, we have a governor that was last in the country for testing, last in the country for vaccination rates, and now is putting his unfortunately limiting our economic recovery through his inability to find solutions. Let's go to, I do want to mention that you all did provide funding for Central Virginia, Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission, and I want to find out how that's been allocated and what are you doing to follow the money to make sure that it's being spent appropriately?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. Yes, as memory serves, that was one of the supplemental awards that we made to our network of economic development districts to support economic recovery planning and coordination of various different types of economic recovery implementation. And so we made those awards on a 2-year basis, recognizing that the economic impacts of the pandemic were likely going to be with us for some time. And we continue to provide traditional oversight of those EDA grant investments with the expectation that those will be resulting in recovery strategies that are very specific to the geography that is served by those entities, and that they will hopefully be coming forward with additional grant proposals for either for EDA or perhaps for other federal partners that may be able to meet their economic development needs.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding your time, Mr. Adderholt.
David Trone of Maryland, you are recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I coming through?
You are.
Great. Thank you today for this critical hearing. EDA is a critical lifeline for many of my constituents in my district, a very rural district. We've seen a steady loss of financial institutions across America, which creates serious challenges for small business in these communities to get traditional financing. COVID's only made it worse, and your RLF program was a tremendous economic lifeline for many small businesses in our district. We had a Western Maryland vending business. The pandemic took its toll. The owner decided to retire, but your loans allowed one of the employees to purchase the business, and they're now flourishing. The Corner Tavern and Cafe in Cumberland closed last March. Again, an EDA CARES loan. They were able to expand their dining options, walk-in, take-out, and they're up and running again. So a few examples of the importance of your resources. For those that question robust EDA funding, can you share how, again, a little bit more about how EDA helps the economy flourish in these economically distressed areas?
Yes, thank you, Representative Trone. And I really appreciate hearing those success stories. And in fact, I'm aware of successes like that have occurred as a result of our lending through the revolving loan fund program across the entire country. And it's really heartening to hear that that has had the intended impact. And in fact, recognizing the dearth of available capital is exactly why EDA chose to invest very heavily in that area at the onset of the pandemic. So, I mean, that is one of our core tools to helping economically distressed areas to rebound and bounce back quickly. Two of the other tools that we commonly use are grants for strategic planning and technical assistance to help areas that have had one of these undermining events to kind of re-envision how they can most expeditiously recover, or and sometimes re-envision a new future that may involve diversification into new areas and economic development endeavors. And then a wide range of different types of infrastructure investments that can support growth and development. And we look for those infrastructure investments to be leveraged, through local matching share, as well as to leverage additional private investment that can really be very transformative and impactful in helping economically distressed areas to recover.
I appreciate that. As I mentioned, the declining number of financial institutions, but the rural communities have many other barriers. It's just so much harder for them to attract private sector investments. So how does EDA plan to leverage federal resources to increase these private sector investments, particularly rural?
Yes, that is unquestionably a challenge where there may be lack of access to capital through traditional lenders, or there may be other challenges to encouraging and bringing private sector investment to a rural or underserved community. And I mean, this is really one of the strengths of the EDA's programming, in that, by making strategic enabling investments, we can sometimes be the first dollars in and send a signal to the marketplace that there is a leading indicator that would attract additional private capital dollars and investment. We also play a very important role in increasing the capacity of these rural areas, and actually enabling them to take advantage of the economic assets that they have at their disposal. For example, many rural communities may have community colleges or other assets that can be leveraged as workforce development engines for industry that may be willing to relocate into an area. Or they may be at a strategic intersection of different types of infrastructure, such as highways or rail lines, et cetera. They can build upon those economic assets to grow and expand their economy. And EDA can support them through additional supplemental infrastructure investments to expand those comparative advantages.
I yield back, and keep helping us on the broadband. That's really key in rural. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. Mr. Palazzo, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really don't have any more questions for Mr. Alvord. I appreciate him coming on, but I would like to just, build on some of the comments from my colleagues, and I want to join with Congressman Klein. This extension of supplemental unemployment is devastating restaurants and small businesses in my district. Right when we think we're coming out of it, I mean, there's a hiring signs on almost every business, and just think of the money we could be saving if we weren't paying people to stay at home, but to get off their butts and get out of their house and go to work. Because it feels like sometimes the federal government's cure to a problem is more dangerous than the disease to begin with. And so we have to get back to work. We have to get our economy going again. I mean, I know you see it's trending up, but then you see an administration doing everything he possibly can to tear down the economy just because Trump had his name on it or his fingerprints, increasing the corporate rates. We're going to see a push for overregulation, a push by big labor. All three of these it was the three-legged stool that drove American companies and American jobs overseas. And it shouldn't be whether you're a Republican or a Democrat to see that when we started peeling back the regulations and we lowered the corporate tax rate, got competitive for the first time in decades, and we weren't kowtowing to the union bosses, we had a record economy, record unemployment, record minority participation in the job market and job creation, all this. And I don't care what administration. It's just like when you see something that works and something that's making America competitive and getting Americans work and your retirement accounts are flush with cash, don't mess with it. Don't mess with it. That's all I had to say. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to filibuster, even though we're not in the Senate. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you for your opinions, Mr. Palazzo. And on that score about Democrats and Republicans, Mr. Albert, the American Rescue Plan puts $3 billion into the EDA, and as Ms. Meng mentioned, pretty much 2/3 of EDA money goes into rural areas, which are mostly represented by Republicans, and who unanimously voted against the American Rescue Plan. My question for you is the administration planning on penalizing any of these Republican districts into which the EDA money is going to go from the American Rescue Plan?
No, Mr. Chairman, it certainly is not. And, EDA investment criteria, as I mentioned earlier, focus very much on economic distress and looking at the types of grant investments that are going to be most impactful in helping to grow and expand the regional economy and the national economy.
Very good. And I'm going to end my filibuster and turn it over to Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification, I know I voted against the last package, the 1.9 trillion. I like things like the $3 billion that goes to EDA. I like I even supported the $2,000 stimulus checks to individuals and the PPP refilling for small businesses, but I still can't figure out where the other, call it 1.5 trillion is going. So I appreciate that you're not punishing those districts that are trying to be fiscally responsible while still navigating a post-pandemic world. And when we talk about the pre-pandemic world, we had literally we had jobs looking for people in many industries. And one of those industries, we touched on it earlier, the aerospace and defense industry, had a lack of engineering talent. We were seeing a rising tide of investments in our military, which was much needed after the Budget Control Act and sequestration. We were seeing a modernization effort of our military, and this helped large prime companies like the Lockheeds and the Boeings of the world, but it trickled down into the mom and pop shops that were making bit and piece components for these larger programs. But we were having a problem in many cases of getting contracts on contract because we didn't have the staffing needs and the headcount needed to do it correctly. I would submit that we'll get through this pandemic, we'll get things back online. We need to continue to invest in our infrastructure, our transportation programs, our military programs. But what I think when things get back to normal and steady state as much as they can is we're going to realize again that we have a talent shortage. And I know that within the EDA you were funded, I believe, $2 million to do an apprenticeship pilot program. Can you talk about how first of all, how was the implementation of that $2 million? That seems like an anemic amount of money. So you probably wouldn't be able to do too much with it, but were there lessons learned, or is there something that you can scale up to from that to help us with this sort of talent and apprenticeship training gap that we have now relative to some of our competitive nations?
Yes, Congressman, thank you so much for that question. It's actually a program that we're quite excited about. It's the STEM apprenticeship program. It was authorized under Section 28 of the Stevenson-Weidler Act, or America Competes Act. And that program has been on the books for quite some time, but it's never been appropriated. And so last year, for the first time, we did receive its first ever appropriation of $2 million. We ran a national competition for that program, which is a little different than the way EDA administers the majority of our grant programs. But we did very much view this as an opportunity to learn some lessons, to your point, about like what would some of the most effective techniques be in workforce development. So just a few months ago, we were able to make the first round of awards. We had 7 awardees. It's a very diverse and eclectic range of different types of organizations that received awards, everything from an Alaskan Native village to a small rural community college and an urban training provider have received assistance under this program. So we're very much looking forward, as they move into the implementation phases, to learning some lessons through the implementation of that program that we can apply to our other work. EDA has traditionally invested in a wide variety of different types of workforce development projects, including infrastructure investments for brick and mortar for skill training facilities. Oftentimes we have funded things like wet dry lab development for training purposes, or in some cases, specialized training equipment. But I think, this new STEM apprenticeship program will give us some valuable lessons in terms of the development of the programs, the program design, as well as the curriculum that may be most successful, particularly in supporting industry needs. I mean, we know that just anecdotally that some of the most successful workforce investments are those that align very closely with, what industry needs, where they have jobs, as you mentioned,
Right.
in your case, in the defense industry.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I think the ask is to make sure that you're communicating and clearly highlighting to us where that line item and the funding for that line item exists, to make sure that we're scaling up and the apprenticeship and the vocational training outside of even four-year universities and at the local community college levels. I think there's a lot of us interested in how do we expand that. So thank you, Mr. Albert. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. And we're going to conclude this hearing. But before we do, I want to give Mr. Adderholt, our ranking member, a chance to exercise his second round, 5 minutes of questions if he chooses.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple more questions I did want to refer to. Mr. Alford, in your testimony, the EDA had made about 1,000 awards to communities across the country. Of all the EDA applications that were submitted for the CARES Act, what did you see was the most frequent requested project type or the purpose?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. I think we saw a very, very diverse range of applications come in, and you probably won't be surprised to hear that the nature of those applications kind of trended with the changing dynamics of the pandemic. Early on, there were a high volume of requests for things like planning, recovery assistance, and as I mentioned before, a preponderance of requests for access to capital, supplemental grants to our revolving loan fund network. But as the impacts of the pandemic became clearer and affected different areas, we certainly saw upticks as various industry sectors were impacted. So things like the travel and tourism sector or the manufacturing sector and its subsequent supply chain, we would see then subsequent waves of investments that were very targeted at those different industry sectors. And we have tried to be agile and adaptable in meeting the needs of those communities as they've changed it over the course of the year of the pandemic.
And what were the total number of applications that you received on the CARES Act funding? Do you know? Can you tell us that number?
Yes, I believe I can. To date, and of course, this is, we're still accepting applications and we're still making grant awards, but to date, we have received 2,392 applications. And as of the 16th of this month, we have awarded 1,020 of those applications.
And what percentage received 100% funding?
I don't know off the top of my head what percentage received 100%. We did have the discretion under the act to go up to 100%. And I would say that given the levels of economic distress, we probably funded a greater percentage at 100 than would traditionally be the case. But that's certainly something I can take back and get for you.
Okay, thanks. And occasionally we hear questions about EDA, how EDA makes decisions to award grants, and what merit the criteria is considered by the agency. For most federal grant programs across other federal agencies, a scoring criteria is published. Can you talk about why EDA does not publish a scoring criteria in particular?
Yes. So well, this varies a little bit from program to program and grant notice of funding opportunity to notice of funding opportunity. But for our core economic development programs, the primary reason is that it's challenging to take kind of a one size fits all approach to like the diverse range of different types of economic development investments that EDA is supporting. So we do establish, through our notices of funding opportunity, the criteria that we will be looking at when we make investments, and we do publish investment priorities to incentivize and guide specific types of investment activities. But we found over time that it's that we can be most successful and that our communities can be most successful when we can take a flexible approach, so that we're not comparing apples to oranges, to train rail spurs, to industrial parks, to strategy grants. Like, because of this really eclectic range, it's hard to come up with a criteria that's one size fits all. Now, sometimes when we have more homogenous programs, we're able to do more of that kind of precise criterion. But we found that overall the flexibility serves our grantees the best.
And then quickly, in administering the CARES Act funding, EDA used automatic non-competitive process to provide funding to economic development districts in good standing, which allowed these districts to quickly ramp up their capacity, able to hire extra staff to serve as disaster recovery coordinators and quickly and efficiently inject needed relief into their community. Will EDA use the same effective and efficient process to administer the American Rescue Plan Act as well?
Well, so we are still in the process of doing our program and implementation plan for the American Rescue Plan. I do think that a greater share of the overall assistance is likely to be provided on a competitive basis across different competitions under the American Rescue Plan. However, there will likely be some instances when we might avail ourselves of the opportunity to, expeditiously provide some assistance to get it out and get it working within targeted populations right away.
Okay. All right. I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Adderholt. And thank you to members of the subcommittee for an interesting and sometimes animated discussion. And thank you especially to Mr. Alvord for your responsive and well-informed answers to our questions. With that, this hearing is hereby adjourned.
Thank you.